It was just another evening at a posh, high-end restaurant known for its elegant ambience and celebrity clientele. The kind of place where every detail, from the shiny silver cutlery to the dimly lit chandeliers, screams luxury. On this particular night, one of the most famous basketball players in the world, Shaquille O'Neal, also known as Big Shaq, decided to visit with some friends. But little did anyone know, this casual dinner would soon turn into a scene that no one would forget. As Shaq walked into the restaurant, he couldn't have looked more out of place. Standing at an imposing 7 feet 1 inch and dressed casually in a red t-shirt, his presence filled the entire room. The luxury of the place seemed to shrink in comparison to the larger-than-life persona walking through the door. His broad shoulders, massive frame, and towering height drew the attention of everyone in the room. However, it wasn't just his physical presence that made him stand out. It was the very aura of confidence and charisma that followed him wherever he went. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq, was no ordinary celebrity. He wasn't just a basketball legend with multiple championship rings or an actor and businessman. He had transformed into a pop culture icon known for his humor, wit, and charm. On that evening, however, he wasn't there to make headlines or to entertain anyone. He was simply looking for a peaceful dinner with friends, an evening of relaxation away from the spotlight. It was one of those rare moments where he could step away from the massive media attention and just enjoy a meal. Yet, the universe had other plans. As Shaq sat at the table, his friends and fellow diners exchanged polite glances, subtly trying to figure out who the towering figure was, despite his casual attire. To some, Shaq was a walking legend, someone they might have seen on TV or heard about in the news. To others, though, he was just another customer in a sea of well-dressed individuals. What no one could have predicted was that the night would take a dramatic turn, not because of the food, but because of one crucial interaction. A waiter, clearly unaware of the celebrity sitting at the table, approached with an attitude that would soon backfire in the most incredible way. The waiter wasn't a stranger to the high-pressure environment of a luxurious restaurant. He was used to dealing with high-maintenance customers, but this particular interaction would test his skills and his knowledge of who he was serving. When the waiter arrived at Shaq's table, he didn't recognize the towering basketball star. In his mind, Shaq was just another man in casual attire who probably didn't understand the expectations of the fine dining experience. And so, with an air of arrogance, the waiter proceeded to offer his unsolicited opinion on Shaq's appearance. "Hey, you can't just come in here dressed like that," the waiter remarked, eyeing the red t-shirt that Shaq had chosen for the evening. "We have a dress code for a reason." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Shaq, who was no stranger to public criticism, didn't let it faze him right away. Instead, he responded with a calm smile, understanding that the waiter probably didn't recognize him. But as the words lingered, something in Shaq's demeanor shifted. This wasn't just any ordinary diner. This was a man who had won multiple NBA championships, built an empire, and had earned the right to dine anywhere in the world without being judged. The waiter, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension, continued his unsolicited critique. "I mean, come on," he added. "You should at least try to make an effort. People come here to experience something special." The rest of the table went silent. The friends seated with Shaq exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension rising. The waiter, who had been so sure of himself moments ago, was now pushing his luck. And then, Shaq dropped the bombshell that no one saw coming. "Let me stop you right there," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't recognize me, do you? Well, let me make it easy for you. I own this restaurant." The waiter's expression shifted instantly, his confident attitude collapsing into a moment of realization. He stood there, frozen, as the words echoed in his mind. The man he had just insulted wasn't a regular customer at all. No, it was Shaquille O'Neal, the very person who owned the place he worked for. Shaq's friends exchanged knowing glances. They could barely contain their laughter as they watched the waiter struggle to comprehend the situation unfolding before him. The waiter opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face turned pale as the full weight of his words sank in. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of high-end luxury to complete awkwardness. The tables around them, once oblivious to the scene, now turned their heads, curious about the commotion. The waiter stammered, trying to recover from his blunder. "I am so sorry, sir," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't recognize you. Please, I didn't mean to offend you." Shaq, ever the professional, kept his cool. He wasn't interested in making the waiter feel worse than he already did. Instead, he took the opportunity to impart a valuable lesson about respect. "It's okay," Shaq said, his voice calm but with a hint of authority. "Just remember, when you work in a place like this, you should treat every guest with the same level of respect, no matter who they are." The tension in the room started to lift as Shaq's friends relaxed. The waiter, realizing just how much he had messed up, nodded profusely, still trying to apologize for his rude behavior. But the damage was done. As Shaq continued to enjoy his meal, the room returned to its usual ambience. The waiter, for the rest of the night, was on edge, serving each customer with an exaggerated politeness, perhaps hoping to erase the embarrassing incident from everyone's memory. And while Shaq wasn't one to hold grudges, he had just taught the young waiter an unforgettable lesson about humility, respect, and the importance of treating everyone equally, regardless of their appearance. In the end, Shaq's quiet evening turned into an unforgettable moment, reminding us all that you never know who you might be serving, and sometimes, the last person you expect to impress is the one who has the power to change everything. When the waiter first arrived at the table, he didn't recognize Shaq. It's not uncommon for some people to miss recognizing famous figures, especially when they're out of their usual element or dressed casually. After all, celebrities are people too, and sometimes they want to break from their larger-than-life persona. But in this case, the waiter made a mistake that would soon become a career-ending moment. With an air of arrogance and a dismissive tone, the waiter took one glance at Shaquille O'Neal and immediately jumped to conclusions. He looked Shaq up and down and made a sarcastic comment about his attire. "Hey, you can't just come in here dressed like that," the waiter remarked with an exaggerated roll of his eyes, clearly thinking he was above the situation. "We have a dress code for a reason." Shaq, who had experienced his fair share of public attention, wasn't offended right away. He smiled at the comment, trying to keep things light and playful. But as the waiter continued, the tension began to build. The entire table went silent, and Shaq's friends exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this was quickly spiraling into something more than a harmless misunderstanding. The waiter, who thought he was simply enforcing the rules of the restaurant, continued to lecture Shaq. He was convinced that Shaq was just another regular customer who didn't understand the rules of fine dining. But what the waiter didn't know was that the man sitting at the table wasn't just some average customer. He wasn't even a celebrity trying to escape the spotlight for a quiet meal. No, the person sitting at that table was Big Shaq, the NBA legend, the towering giant of a man whose presence alone commanded respect. Shaquille O'Neal had been in the spotlight for decades and had seen more than his fair share of high-end restaurants. But he wasn't there that night to be a showstopper. He was simply looking for a peaceful evening out with friends, just like anyone else. Shaq had always been known for his sense of humor, his larger-than-life personality, and his ability to laugh off almost anything. He wasn't the type to get easily upset. But as the waiter continued to treat him like an average Joe, Shaq's smile faded, and the atmosphere at the table began to shift. This wasn't just about a man's choice of clothing, it was about respect. And Shaq wasn't someone who took kindly to being disrespected, especially not in his own establishment. As the waiter continued with his unsolicited critique, Shaq stayed calm. He wasn't looking to create a scene, but he also wasn't going to let the situation go without addressing it. He knew that this was a moment to teach a lesson, not just for the waiter, but for everyone who might be watching. Shaq's demeanor didn't change, but the room seemed to hold its breath as the waiter, oblivious to whom he was speaking, went on. He lectured Shaq about dressing appropriately, saying things like, "You should at least try to dress like you belong here." The rest of the table shifted uncomfortably, and Shaq's friends could feel the tension mounting. They knew that Shaq wasn't the kind of guy to back down from a challenge. Finally, Shaq decided it was time to set the record straight. "Let me stop you right there," Shaq said, his voice steady, but with an underlying firmness that made the waiter pause. "You don't recognize me, do you?" The waiter, clearly confused, stammered a bit but continued. "Oh, no, I don't. Should I?" Shaq, leaning back in his chair, gave a small, knowing grin. "Well, let me make it easy for you," he said, his tone calm yet undeniably powerful. "I own this restaurant." The waiter's eyes widened in shock. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant, the cocky attitude replaced by a stunned realization. He stood there, frozen, as the words hung in the air. Shaq, the giant sitting in front of him, wasn't just another customer. He was the very person who controlled the restaurant. The air in the room became thick with tension as the rest of the diners quietly observed the exchange. Some may have recognized Shaq, while others were simply watching as the drama unfolded in real time. The waiter's face turned pale as the realization hit him. He had just insulted his boss, someone who had spent years building a legacy, both on and off the basketball court. The man who had just been the target of his condescending comments wasn't just some ordinary diner. He was Shaquille O'Neal, the kind of person who could easily make or break someone's career with a simple word. Shaq didn't want to humiliate the waiter. He didn't need to. He wasn't the type to make a scene for the sake of it. But this was an opportunity for the waiter to learn something that would likely stick with him for the rest of his career. Shaq could have responded angrily, but instead, he chose to educate. With a calm smile, he looked at the waiter and said, "When you work in a place like this, you need to show respect to everyone, no matter who they are. Whether they're in a suit or a t-shirt, you treat them with kindness. It doesn't matter if you're serving the CEO of a company or someone like me. Everyone deserves respect." The waiter stammered, trying to apologize, but the damage had already been done. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Shaq raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. "It's okay," he said. "Just remember this for the future. Treat every guest with respect. You never know who you're talking to." The waiter nodded profusely, his face flushed with embarrassment. As he hurried off to the kitchen, the entire table exhaled, the tension lifting as quickly as it had arrived. The rest of the evening went on as planned, with Shaq and his friends enjoying their meal. Shaq, ever the professional, didn't let the incident ruin his night, but it was clear that the lesson had been learned. For the waiter, however, the night was far from over. He had just been schooled by one of the most famous basketball players in the world, and his career would forever be marked by the lesson that you never know who you're serving. As the waiter continued to chastise Shaq, the entire table of friends exchanged uneasy glances. They could see the situation escalating and knew that things weren't going to end well if the waiter kept pushing. Shaq, however, remained calm, almost as though he were letting the situation play out for the sheer entertainment value. His friends were clearly uncomfortable, but Shaq seemed to be enjoying the tension in the air, an unspoken challenge brewing between him and the arrogant waiter. The waiter, oblivious to the fact that he was digging himself deeper, continued his rant about Shaq's attire. He was oblivious to the gravity of the situation, feeling superior in his position, as though he was the one in charge of the dining experience. He went on to explain how the restaurant had certain standards to uphold, listing rules that were clearly designed to keep the clientele sophisticated and dignified. But with each passing word, the waiter's arrogance seemed to inflate as he failed to notice the growing tension at Shaq's table. Shaq's friends, meanwhile, couldn't help but exchange looks of disbelief. They knew that Shaq wasn't the type to pick a fight, but this waiter had just crossed a line. Everyone in the restaurant seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what was going to happen next. The waiter's self-righteous attitude continued, and Shaq's grin grew slightly wider, making it clear that he was, for once, enjoying the drama. When the waiter finally finished his unsolicited rant, Shaq, ever the patient one, decided it was time to intervene. In a move that was as smooth as it was surprising, Shaq calmly placed his hands on the table and leaned forward, locking eyes with the waiter. The room, which had been buzzing with awkward energy, seemed to quiet down as everyone instinctively sensed that something big was about to happen. "Let me stop you right there," Shaq said with a grin, his tone now shifting from patient to playful, but with a note of authority that could not be ignored. "You don't recognize me, do you? Well, let me make it easy for you. I own this restaurant." The words hit like a bombshell dropped right in the middle of the dining room. Time seemed to freeze. The waiter's face turned an ashen shade of pale, his eyes widening as he processed what Shaq had just said. For a few moments, the waiter stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to find words but coming up completely empty. He was frozen in shock, his mind racing as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The man he had just insulted, the man he had just lectured about dress code, the man he thought was a random diner dressed casually, was none other than the very person who controlled the establishment, the man who could make or break his career with a single word. Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, the giant of the NBA, was not just another celebrity guest. He was the owner of the restaurant. The waiter stood motionless, unable to comprehend the gravity of his error. It wasn't just that he had spoken out of turn to a paying customer. He had insulted the owner of the restaurant, the person who signed his paycheck, the person whose face and name were plastered on every marketing campaign and TV ad for the business. Shaq's friends exchanged knowing smiles and quiet chuckles as they watched the waiter struggle. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. What had started as a tense moment between a rude waiter and a customer had now morphed into a full-on lesson in humility. Shaquille O'Neal, known for his light-hearted and humorous approach to life, wasn't one to let the moment pass quietly. While many might have used the moment to put the waiter down or publicly humiliate him, Shaq, in his infinite wisdom, chose to have a little fun with the situation. His calm demeanor and easygoing smile only added to the surreal nature of the scene. The waiter, desperate to recover, tried to apologize, his voice shaky and laced with panic. "I am so sorry, sir," he stammered, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't know. Please forgive me. I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't realize." Shaq, looking around the table at his friends, let out a soft chuckle. "It's okay, man. I get it. You were just doing your job. But next time, remember, always treat people with respect, no matter who they are." He paused for a second and added, "Because you never know who you're talking to." The waiter nodded, his hands shaking as he tried to collect himself. I understand. It won't happen again. Please, let me make it up to you. Whatever you want, it's on the house." Shaq's friends, clearly enjoying the spectacle, leaned in slightly as the waiter continued to apologize profusely. It was clear that the waiter wasn't just apologizing to Shaq anymore. He was apologizing to himself for the massive misstep he had just made. And yet, despite his desperation, Shaq wasn't interested in making the situation worse. He simply waved off the waiter's repeated apologies. "No need to go overboard, man," Shaq said, his tone still calm and friendly. "Just remember that we all deserve respect, no matter who we are or what we're wearing." The waiter, now completely deflated, nodded vigorously. He quickly walked away from the table, disappearing into the kitchen, his head hung low. The rest of the dining room, which had been quietly watching the unfolding drama, resumed their meals, some of them exchanging whispers about the bizarre encounter. As the night went on, Shaq and his friends continued their meal, the atmosphere in the restaurant slowly returning to normal. The waiter, on the other hand, spent the remainder of the evening in a nervous state, constantly looking over his shoulder and hoping that the incident wouldn't be remembered. But for him, the lesson had been learned in the hardest possible way. Shaq, ever the gracious owner, wasn't looking to punish him, but the reality was clear: you never know who's sitting at your table. For the waiter, it was a career-defining moment. He had been schooled by the very person he had disrespected, and it was a lesson that he would likely carry with him for the rest of his life. The waiter, now realizing his colossal mistake, began to backpedal rapidly. His palms were sweating, his voice shaky, and a sense of panic started to set in. His mind raced through all the possible consequences of his actions, wondering if he had just made a career-ending decision. "I am so sorry, sir. I didn't recognize you. Please, don't report me. I'll do anything to make it up to you," he stammered, his words tripping over themselves in his haste. Shaquille O'Neal, despite the shock of being disrespected, remained incredibly composed. Ever the professional, he didn't want to escalate the situation further. In fact, Shaq wasn't looking to punish the waiter or make an example of him. He wasn't about to ruin someone's livelihood over a momentary lapse in judgment. Instead of calling out the waiter in front of the entire restaurant, embarrassing him in front of everyone, Shaq simply smiled, his expression both friendly and firm. "I'll let it slide this time," Shaq said, his voice calm, almost as if the situation had been a mere blip on the radar. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the tension in the room felt like it had been diffused. Shaq's aura of calm authority was enough to shift the entire dynamic. "But don't forget," he continued, locking eyes with the waiter, "when you're working in a place like this, you need to show respect to every guest, no matter who they are or how they're dressed." The waiter's face, which had been pale with shock, began to regain some color. He nodded vigorously, the gravity of what had just transpired sinking in. The entire restaurant, which had been holding its breath, exhaled collectively as the awkward tension lifted. In that moment, the atmosphere returned to its usual quiet elegance. The chatter around the room picked up again, but the waiter couldn't escape the lesson he had just learned. His hands, still trembling slightly, gripped the notepad in his hand, and he moved away from the table as quickly as he could, eager to return to the kitchen, where he could collect himself in private. Meanwhile, Shaq's friends couldn't help but exchange glances and smirks. They had all witnessed the uncomfortable situation and had been anxiously waiting to see how Shaq would handle it. They knew Shaq had a reputation for being easygoing and good-natured, but none of them had expected him to handle this with such grace. He could have easily taken advantage of the situation, maybe even demanded the waiter be reprimanded or fired, but instead, Shaq chose to teach a lesson in kindness and respect. He had demonstrated that true power wasn't in exerting control over others, but in showing restraint and understanding. As the waiter disappeared into the kitchen, still visibly shaken, Shaq leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath, letting the moment pass. He glanced around the table at his friends, who were still trying to hold back their amusement. The tension had dissipated, and the evening, though interrupted, could now continue on a lighter note. Shaq smiled and raised his glass, as if to signal that the incident was behind them. "Don't sweat it," he said to his friends, trying to ease any remaining awkwardness. "I just hope that waiter learned something tonight." His friends nodded, appreciating his level-headed approach. They knew Shaq was a man who had been in the public eye for decades, and his reputation as both a dominant athlete and a genuinely kind individual had only grown over time. What many people didn't realize, however, was that Shaq had long since mastered the art of navigating difficult situations with humor and wisdom. He wasn't out to humiliate the waiter. He simply wanted to make sure that the next time he served someone, he would be more mindful and respectful. The rest of the evening was filled with laughter, good food, and lively conversation. Shaq's friends were eager to put the awkward moment behind them, and despite the initial tension, the rest of the dinner played out without incident. But deep down, the waiter would never forget what had happened. In the days that followed, the story of the man who insulted Shaq would circulate throughout the restaurant, a cautionary tale about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance, attire, or status. As for Shaq, he never brought up the incident again. He understood that, sometimes, people just needed to learn from their mistakes. In his mind, the waiter had been given a second chance, a rare opportunity to correct his behavior without suffering harsh consequences. That was the kind of person Shaq was. He didn't believe in pushing others down when they made mistakes. Instead, he believed in offering a helping hand, offering lessons, and empowering others to do better next time. By the time Shaq left the restaurant, the waiter had already returned to his duties, a little more humble and a lot more cautious. As Shaq walked out, his towering presence once again made an impact on everyone in the room. But now, it wasn't just because of his size. It was because of his character, his ability to rise above the situation and handle it with maturity, patience, and dignity. The waiter, now fully aware of the mistake he had made, would no doubt carry the lesson with him for the rest of his career. And for Shaq, it was just another night of showing the world that sometimes, true strength lies in choosing not to make a scene, but in using the opportunity to teach, inspire, and, most importantly, lead by example. As the night went on, the atmosphere slowly began to settle back into its usual refined rhythm. The clink of glasses, the gentle hum of conversation, and the soft sounds of cutlery against fine china filled the air once again. Shaquille O'Neal, ever the professional, resumed his dinner with friends, laughing and chatting as though nothing had happened. He was unbothered by the earlier incident. In fact, he didn't allow it to sour the evening or disrupt his enjoyment of the moment. Shaq's calm demeanor was contagious, and it quickly put his friends at ease. They could tell that for him. It was just another small blip in an otherwise fantastic evening. The group went on to enjoy their meal, exchanging stories and jokes, with Shaq himself contributing to the jovial atmosphere, as always. But for the staff, the situation was far from over. Despite the evening resuming its usual flow, they couldn't shake the discomfort of what had just unfolded. The power dynamics in the restaurant had shifted in an instant, and the story of what had happened spread like wildfire behind the scenes. Word quickly circulated among the waitstaff, kitchen crew, and managers that the man they had all thought was just another casual guest was, in fact, the owner of the establishment. The realization sent ripples through the entire team. They were all too aware of the mistake they had just witnessed, and no one could ignore the awkward tension that had enveloped the restaurant for a few brief moments. The waiter, who had been at the center of the incident, felt the weight of his mistake bearing down on him. He had insulted the very man who owned the place, someone with the power to change his future in a single moment. As the evening wore on, he couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. He was a professional, or at least he had prided himself on being one. But now, he had learned an invaluable lesson the hard way. He had learned that respect should be given to every guest, regardless of their appearance or status, and that first impressions could make all the difference. He realized that in a world as interconnected as the one they lived in, you never knew who might be sitting across from you. Later that night, after the last guest had left, the manager of the restaurant approached Shaq to offer an apology. The manager, who had overheard bits of the exchange, knew it was important to address the situation quickly and professionally. He made his way over to Shaq's table, his face filled with concern. The staff had already been briefed about the incident, and the manager wanted to make sure Shaq knew that the restaurant took the matter seriously. Shaq, however, handled the situation with the same grace he had displayed all evening. As the manager approached, Shaq greeted him with a warm smile, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The manager, sensing that Shaq wasn't looking to escalate the issue, immediately began to apologize for the behavior of the waiter. "I am so sorry about what happened tonight, Mr. O'Neill," the manager said, his tone sincere and regretful. "We take pride in treating every guest with respect, and we certainly don't want you to feel disrespected in our establishment. Please, allow me to offer my deepest apologies on behalf of the entire staff." Shaq waved off the apology, shaking his head as if it were of no consequence. "It's okay," Shaq said with a calm reassurance. "It was just a small misunderstanding. It happens. I'm not here to make a scene or cause trouble. We're all human, and we make mistakes." The manager, clearly relieved by Shaq's understanding response, nodded gratefully. "Thank you for your kindness, sir," he said, his shoulders visibly relaxing. "I can assure you that we've already spoken to the waiter, and he fully understands the gravity of what transpired. It won't happen again." Shaq smiled, knowing that the manager was doing his part to correct the situation. "That's all I ask," Shaq replied. "Everyone deserves respect, whether they're here to enjoy a meal or whether they're the person who owns the place. I just hope this serves as a reminder to always treat people with kindness." For the waiter, this night would go down in history as one of the most humbling moments of his career. He had learned a hard lesson in humility and respect that, no doubt, would stick with him for years to come. No longer would he make assumptions based on a person's appearance or attire. No longer would he ever let his ego cloud his judgment. The experience had burned into his mind a simple but important truth. You never know who you might be serving. It was a realization that might have come too late in the moment, but at least he would carry it with him going forward. For Shaq, it was just another day in the life of a man who owned not only multiple businesses, but also knew how to handle any situation with grace, humor, and wisdom. While most people would have been quick to make a scene or to hold a grudge, Shaq chose a different path. He understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to forgive, let go, and move forward. He wasn't interested in ruining anyone's career over a single mistake. Instead, he used the opportunity to teach, to remind others of the importance of kindness and respect in every interaction. The moral of the story? It's simple, really. Always treat others with respect. You never know who they might be. One moment, you might be serving someone in a high-end restaurant, and the next, you could be facing the very person who owns the business. Never let appearances fool you, because in this world, anyone can surprise you. Big Shaq's reaction to this incident was a perfect example of leadership. He didn't choose to humiliate the waiter or make him the subject of a public spectacle. Instead, he took the opportunity to guide, to teach, and to show that true strength lies in how you handle difficult situations. For the waiter, it was an unforgettable lesson in humility and respect. And for the rest of the restaurant staff, it was a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and every guest deserves to be treated with dignity. At the end of the day, it was a story of growth, for both Shaq and the waiter, and a story that reminded everyone in that restaurant, and perhaps anyone who hears about it, that respect and humility are the true keys to success. You never know who you're sitting next to or serving, so always choose respect. After all, you might just be serving someone who holds the keys to the kingdom. Imagine this. A waiter insults a customer, thinking he's just another guy in a red t-shirt. But what he doesn't know? That regular guy is none other than NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal, and he owns the restaurant. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stick around to find out how one arrogant mistake turns into a lesson in respect that no one will forget.